My name's Natasha Jackson, and I've been in the brokerage industry for 15 years. Currently, I'm assigned to the brokerage compliance department, where I manage a team dedicated to UPS's focus on compliance. I'm excited for our webinar today regarding Imports 101, Get to Know the Basics, where we will help with understanding basic importing requirements, forms and terminology, and provide information on free trade agreements, just to name a few of the topics. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, I'd like to mention a couple of things. Question and answers. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. For our presentation, you can download a copy of the presentation slides under the Related Content panel at the bottom of your screen. Also, many of the URLs we reference will be located in this section. And lastly, webinar recording. We do record our webinars, and we will send a link for you to watch it again or share it with your colleagues. You can find this webinar and all our previous webinars at www.ups.com/webinars. All right, let's meet our speaker for today. I'm pleased to introduce to our audience Russ Lawhorn. Russ has been in the brokerage industry for decades and is currently a manager in the UPS Brokerage Compliance Department. Welcome, Russ.
Thanks, Natasha.
Before I turn the presentation over to him, I'd like to kick off the webinar with a short video from our friends at CBP regarding importing into the U.S.
Commercial goods arriving into the U.S. by air, land, or sea are subject to import laws, duty taxes, and fees. What are some examples of commercial goods? A purse bought online from a retailer in Italy, glasses manufactured by a factory in China, or even a souvenir sent back to the U.S. but purchased while traveling abroad. Commercial goods arriving into the U.S. by air, land, or sea are subject to import laws, duty taxes, and fees. What are some examples of commercial goods? A purse bought online from a retailer in Italy, glasses manufactured by a factory in China, or even a souvenir sent back to the U.S. but purchased while traveling abroad. To lawfully enter foreign imports into a U.S. port of entry, which can be air, land, or sea, you must obtain approval from CBP through the import process, which varies based on the merchandise. You should always reach out to a CBP import specialist at the Center of Excellence and Expertise before importing into the USA. Let's take a closer look at the CBP import process. The first step is when someone purchases foreign goods with plans to have those items come into the U.S. Once those goods are available, the seller or manufacturer ships them to the United States. For example, small shipments may be consolidated into a container or sent by airplane, truck, or rail. These smaller packages are often cleared through the CBP import process by logistics companies hired by online sellers and may arrive right to your door. Larger shipments are loaded into containers and placed on different modes of transportation. When the vessel operator receives the goods, they provide the shipper with a bill of lading, which serves as a receipt. This is required for the importer to file an entry with CBP. An electronic cargo declaration must be transmitted to CBP 24 hours before the cargo is laden aboard the vessel. CBP then determines whether the shipment requires further examination upon arrival. Once the vessel arrives and CBP has permitted the release of the cargo, the containers are offloaded and transported from the port. The importer receives a notice of arrival when the cargo arrives, with details for pickup. With the notice of arrival and bill of lading, the importer can file entry documents with CBP at the port where the goods arrived. This is the formal request for customs release. The importer may enter goods themselves as owner of the cargo, or they may hire a customs broker. As a shipper of goods, you may elect to have a broker. Brokers are licensed by CBP and are experts in these procedures. A list of customs brokers can be found on cbp.gov. Within 15 days of arrival, an electronic filing must be completed on the Automated Commercial Environment, or ACE system. Depending upon the situation, the importer may need to present other documents, such as a customs bond, which is a contract between customs and an importer for any given import transaction, to guarantee payment of import duties, taxes, and fees to the U.S. While there are different types of entries, it's important, especially for first-time importers, to be aware of several key concepts. Let's review some of them now. Types of entry: formal entries and informal entries, including packages that qualify as Section 321 shipments. The documents for each entry type have separate requirements. An informal entry may involve goods valued less than $2,500, while a formal entry covers goods valued at $2,500 or more. Though just the value may not be the only determining factor of entry type, formal entries also require a customs bond. Duty on formal and informal entries is assessed based on how goods are categorized in the harmonized tariff schedule of the U.S. Other processing fees may be assessed as applicable. Importers are not required to pay duties or fees on goods less than $800 that qualify as Section 321. If goods are selected for examination, CBP will inspect the shipment to determine if they're admissible. If applicable, they will be detained and may be seized. In some instances, importers may be permitted to re-export the goods, or they may be brought into compliance upon determination that all import requirements have been ultimately satisfied. Once the goods are released with all duties, taxes, and fees paid, and the CBP Form 7501 filed electronically within 10 working days from the release date, the importer may pick up the goods at a destination arranged with the shipper. In some instances, CBP may choose to conduct an entry review. This may result in a duties refund, additional duties, or a request for additional documentation. The final step is known as liquidation process, which occurs when CBP finalizes the duty assessment. When liquidation is finalized, the entry process is complete. However, importers must keep all documentation for 5 years. More detailed resources and helpful guides can be found at cbp.gov.
Well, hopefully everyone enjoyed that video, and I'll turn it over to Russ to resume with the agenda. Russ?
Ways to save on duty, as well as that process, and give you some of the best resources so that you can go out there and research the import process and become an expert. I know we all feel like experts after watching that video, but it can be a little bit more complicated than the video made it out to be. But before I get rolling, I kind of want to talk about some just import facts. When I was approached to do the webinar, I thought, well, I'll come up with some amazing stats or facts, trade tidbits and things to wow the audience. And, in 2022, the U.S. was the world's largest importer. So, when you think about our economy and purchases and things like that, it's a very consumptive economy in the U.S. And it's no surprise to me that, the U.S. is the world's largest importer. But then you start looking at our trade partners. Who is the U.S. trading the most with? Who are we importing the most from? So you can see the countries listed there. China, in 2022 was $541 billion in imports into the United States in value. So you can think of China as kind of like on their own level when you look at these amounts. 541. Mexico and Canada, you see they're in that high 300 billion range of goods imported into the U.S. And if you go back to 2021, these numbers, Canada and Mexico, sometimes they flip places. Canada may be number 2, Mexico number 3. They do alternate. And then thirdly, I like to consider that the third tier, right, is that Japan at 139 billion. You can see that, comparative the where they're at, you can see China being the 4th country, but look how far below they are. I mean, Japan being the 4th country, see how far below they are from China. So you can see that trade disparity there. And, with U.S. and China trade, and some people would let you know that the trade war going on between U.S. and China, this kind of brings that more clarity. You can see how much product we bring in from China. Also, in terms of fiscal year 2022, with the video being from CBP, we've got to throw some stats out there to you about CBP. And in 2022, their fiscal years run from October to October for the government. So this actually started in, for them, October 2022, and it ended in October 2023, their fiscal year. CBP processed 39.1 million entries. Not paper. Trust me, it's all electronic, the data going through CBP, and they collected an astounding 111.8 billion in duties and fees. And CBP has more than 60,000 employees worldwide, and they're one of the largest law enforcement organizations in the world. So rightfully so, with their mission and all that they have to do at CBP in protecting the United States, our borders, as well as our trade facilitation that they do. And I guess the last stat that I kind of wanted to throw in there for you is every day in the U.S., 100 acres of pizza are served. So I know it's around lunchtime for a lot of you. Maybe you ate a slice of pizza and you're contributing to this stat, but 100 acres of pizza served daily in the U.S., I was not aware of that. So there's the interesting trade stats for you in terms of that, trade and consumption, I guess, if you want to include the pizza. Going back and kind of referencing the video from CBP, it threw out a bunch of terms, and we're going to take some time. We're going to explain these terms, responsibilities of the terms, things like that. So the importer of record, and the importer of record, it can be the owner, right? And in some cases, that can be the the people that you're purchasing the goods from, or the purchaser of the goods, right? Yourself, the importer, or when designated by the owner, purchaser, or consignee, a licensed custom house broker. So via a POA, someone could give POA to a broker, and we'll talk about POAs in a second, and the broker can kind of do their customs work for them. And it's kind of recommended in terms of that. If you're new to importing and stuff like that, you need to align yourself with a good customs broker. The IOR's responsibility. These are definitions from CBP. It's the IOR's responsible to exercise reasonable care. And you say, what is reasonable care? And reasonable care is basically over the whole import process of transaction. You need to be sure that you're not importing drugs, you're not importing intellectual property things, counterfeit items. You saw in the video, it talked about seizing of counterfeit things. So you need to do your due diligence on who you're doing business with overseas, right? That's that reasonable care. The next one would be the accuracy of declarations made at entry. And declarations, right, is your values, right, of the goods, is your quantities, is your weights, the actual things that are going to affect the entry into the United States. You have to make sure they're very accurate. You don't want to ever falsify any information to CBP or anything like that, because that's only going to lead to a typical seizure, request for more information, a customs audit. That's definitely not a path you want to go down to as an importer. And the payment of duties and taxes. Some people will say, well, I import goods, and who's responsible for paying the duties and taxes to CBP? That's the IOR. The importer of record is responsible for the duties and taxes, as well as the maintenance of records. It is the importer of record's responsibility to maintain those records. We'll talk about record keeping a little bit later, but it is 5 years. You need to keep, if you're the importer of record, 5 years of your record keeping of imports into the U.S. that you've been the IOR on coming into the U.S. Tidbit of information there in UPS, our small pack service that we offer to customers. Basically, on shipments valued up to $50,000, UPS assumes the role of IOR on routine entry clearance. So that's kind of a good thing to know, is that UPS will act as your IOR on certain shipments in our small package environment. The other thing on the screen is, what is a customs broker? Well, I think at last count, there's a little over 16,000 active licensed customs brokers in the United States. And basically, anything CBP is out there on their website, cbp.gov. So that's kind of the broker definition. Power of attorney, as I mentioned earlier, and kind of the POA it's a legal document, right? And it's signed between the importer as well as the broker. And that allows that broker, right, to submit paperwork on your behalf to CBP. So if you're thinking about importing and things, and you're going to be an importer of record and things like that, you have to make sure that your broker has your power of attorney. Otherwise, that broker, he can't submit things to customs without your approval, without your power of attorney allowing him to be your agent between customs. So, sometimes shipments come into the U.S., importers didn't have a relationship with the broker, or they didn't give that broker the POA, and their goods get held. Because basically the broker's hands are tied, right? Unless one, the broker's going to be the IOR, which is kind of rare, but UPS does that in certain cases. Or they're going to wait for you to sign the POA and turn that over to the broker. Then the broker can submit the paperwork on your behalf to CBP. So that kind of takes care of like brokers, importer of records, how they get merged together, linked together via the POA. And the video talked about surety bonds. And bonds, basically, it's a contract guaranteeing payment of duties and taxes to customs. So it's important to know that a bond, right, it isn't like getting you off the hook for payment of duties and taxes. It is so that U.S. Customs, if they come to the importer of record and they default and don't pay the duties and taxes, Customs gets to go to the surety bond, the surety company, and say, the importer of record didn't pay us the duties and taxes, we're here to collect. So think of it as that's kind of Customs insurance of getting their duties and taxes. They're going to get their money. Trust me. It's either going to be from you or it's going to be from the surety company. Okay. And there's two types of bonds. One's a single entry bond, and that's valid for one importation only. So, if you were going to start up importing and you said, well, I'm only going to import maybe just a couple things, a single entry bond would maybe be the way to go for you economically, right? A single entry bond. Just to kind of give you a range of cost of bonds, single entry bond, it's probably going to be in the neighborhood of a $40 to $65 single entry bond. Depends on the amount of coverage that you have to have, but you're looking at about an expense of about $40 to $65 for a single entry bond. The other type of bond, the continuous customs bond. Now this bond is good for imports up to a 12-month period. So you can bring in as many entries as you want under a continuous customs bond, as long as you have the bond coverage amount, right? For continuous bonds, that minimum is $50,000. So for a continuous bond, in market prices, you're probably going to pay somewhere in the range of $530 to $600 for a continuous bond. And that depends on coverage, the amount of coverage. If you want a higher bond, right, you're going to get a $100,000 bond. You're going to pay more than that in terms of bond. So it's always interesting to know what you're going to import. If it's one time, if it's 2 or 3 times, you can look at that cost of a single entry bond. It may be better to just do single entry bonds if you were going to do maybe 1, 2, 3, 1 to 4 entries maybe. But if you're going to import more than that, you're going to start doing it on a very regular basis, you need to go ahead and purchase a continuous customs bond because it'll have you covered for a 12-month period. UPS sells bonds for our customers, whether it be a single entry or a continuous bond through our UPS Capital. Some other surety companies out there are Roanoke and Avalon. There are a couple names, big good names that are in the surety bond business. So prior to that importation, if you're going to be an importer of record, you're going to have to purchase a surety bond, whether it be a single entry or whether it be a continuous. That's something that you're going to have to do and look forward to in terms of that. Okay. Next thing that importers really need to look at is incoterms. And the term, the international commercial terms. You hear some people call it ICT. I've heard it references that, but most people call this incoterms. And there's basically a set of 11 incoterms out there. With 7 of the rules, they're applicable to any kind of transportation. And when I say transportation, I mean like air, ocean, rail, inland sea transport, things like that. There's 4 remaining rules, or FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF, and they may be used for only sea or inland waterway transportation. So I want to step through these Incoterms, and hopefully after I'm done, you'll kind of have an idea of it. And under our related content on the screen, the PowerPoint is available. So the PowerPoint basically that you download will have the long definitions, but what you see on my screen is not the long definition, okay? So let's look at Ex Works first. If you are going to import some merchandise, you're talking to a supplier, and he basically is going to give you a price, and he's going to say, okay, my Incoterms are going to be Ex Works. And what that means is Ex Works means that the buyer, that's going to be you, assumes all costs and responsibilities involved in transporting the goods from the named place of delivery. That's typically their factory, right? including the loading of the goods on the buyer's collecting vehicle. So if someone sells you, say, $10,000 worth of merchandise, and they say, our Incoterms are going to be X works, that means you're going to have to pay someone to go to their factory or the pickup point, pick up the goods and transport that to the port, get it all ready for export delivery, export to the U.S., clear through customs, pay the duties and taxes, and pay the expense of delivering it. So when you look at these on the page, EXW down to DDP, the shipper's responsibility and risk gets greater as we go through. The importer, on the flip side, right, their risk decreases. So like I said, the definitions are on FCC. Let's look at like DAP, delivered at place. So the seller is responsible for the delivery of the goods ready for unloading at the named place of destination. It can be the buyer's place of business. And the seller generally assumes all risk and pays all charges associated with that shipment up to the named place of destination. So you can see that the seller then is incurring that risk, right, to move those goods out of their factory all the way to the place of destination under DAP Incoterm. So, obviously that seller is going to incur expense for that. It's going to be more than the cost of the goods in terms of that, right? Because they're going to have all that freight. They're going to have duties and taxes if there need to be from an export side and to the destination that you name in that contract of your Incoterms. The last one there, the delivered duty paid, I'll cover that because all the responsibility is on the buyer's side. They have to, on the seller side, the seller is responsible for all risk and costs associated with shipping, delivering the goods to a named place to the destination. Now that could be your business in the U.S. or a warehouse in the U.S. where you want the shipper or seller to deliver the goods. And that includes export clearance, all transportation, and significantly the import clearances. You want that seller to pay the duties, taxes, and take care of the customs entry. So that's delivered duty paid. So as you can see, where we started at X works, all the way down to delivered duty pay, the seller's expenses started increasing while the importer's risk and expenses decreased down. And the reason why this is important, I guess to put it in a broad concept for you, is if you were assuming two contracts from two suppliers, and one said, well, we'll sell you the goods, $10,000 X works. And you had another supplier says, I'm going to sell you for the same product, it's $10,000 DDP. As the importer, right, that better deal for you is the DDP because that seller of those goods has to take care of all those costs. Terms. Next up, your shipper, your seller, they're going to fill this document out, and it's the commercial invoice, right? And invoices are required for export shipments that are leaving other countries coming into the U.S. And it has to be in English, and there's a copy of the commercial invoice, a sample on the right-hand side of the screen. But you can see that the invoice must contain shipper's name, their address, the contact information, as well as the receiver, a clear description, quantity, and value of the goods. You can't stress a clear description. If your shipper puts a description of clothing on there, that's not going to get it with U.S. Customs. They're going to have a better description. Is it men's or women's clothing? What's the fabric content? Is it cotton? Is it silk? Those type of things. And what's the value? What's the value of those goods did they pay? Coming up with arbitrary descriptions, arbitrary values, it's just going to lead to customs holds, delays. Customs will hold a shipment up and say, they'll tell the broker or they'll contact you and say, we need the proper value. And typically what customs will say is, what did you pay for the goods? What's the value of the merchandise that you paid for? So clear descriptions, quantities, value of goods are important. So you need to be sure that your shipper is putting that kind of information on the commercial invoice that they're going to provide with the shipment, along with the HS classification code. Some of the shippers and sellers, they'll know their HS classification code, but if they don't, and you do know the HS code of your products, provide that to them and tell them to put that on the commercial invoice so that that's visible to see for your broker as well as customs. And country of origin, that's important to put. Where were the goods manufactured? what country, because of free trade agreements, because of embargoes and sanctions. Country of origin is very important. It's not as important as the value of the goods, but it's up there with that. It's in the criticality of clearing your goods, declaring the country of origin where it's from. Because you could have something that's manufactured or made in Germany, but it's shipped to the U.S. from Great Britain. The country of origin is Germany. The export country is Great Britain. So that's important to know, because that can come into play with duty assessment and things like that from a customs standpoint. So we'll cover HS classification a little bit later, but this is commercial invoice. So it's one of the critical pieces to importing into the United States. Okay. Let's talk about types of entry. The video did a good job of talking about the different types of entry in the U.S. And, the most common type is the consumption entry, because the merchandise will be used or consumed in the United States. And the entries require payment and duties of taxes within 10 days of release. So, we talked about duties and taxes. We talked about who's responsible for the payment of those duties and taxes. Remember, it's the importer of record, the IOR, is who is responsible for the payment of those duties and taxes. So when we talk about payment a little bit later, you'll see some options that importers have in terms of paying the duties and taxes, but you don't have a luxury of changing the date in terms of that. And like the video said, formal entries, these are shipments valued at $2,500 or more, or if it's a specific commodity that requires a formal entry regardless of value, as well as on some imports, the customs agent can declare, he can say, regardless of value, he can say, I request a formal entry on this shipment. So customs agent, it is within the purview of their regulatory statute and law that they can request a formal entry at time of release in terms of that. But the big thing is to remember about formals. Generally, broad stroke, it's $2,500 or up. You will need a customs bond for formal entries in terms of that. Informal entries are $2,500 to $800, and it talked about Section 321 de minimis value. De minimis value basically is a shipment that's less than $800. They can come into the United States. They don't need a specific entry made. Basically, it's a type of informal entry, but it's released off a manifest, and there's no duty on anything under $800 Section 321s. There are exceptions. Certain products do not qualify for Section 321, and informal entries have to be made, and some of them, some commodities require formal entry, as I mentioned. So think of that as kind of, I like to break it into buckets. So I would say my formal bucket is $2,500 and up. My informal bucket is $800 to $2,500, and my Section 321 is $800 and below, unless we're into special commodities that you're importing. That's the types of entries. Let's talk about tariff codes now, because tariff codes basically are going to drive the duty rate. And the harmonized system is basically ran by the World Customs Organization, or the WCO. And kind of the 200 countries have got together in the WCO. It covers 98% of all international trade, and they've agreed to the first 6 digits. So a lot of times you'll see, sometimes shippers will provide that to you. They'll give you the first 6 digits, if it's a supplier in Germany or Great Britain who are members of the WCO, they will give you that first 6 digits, because they may not be aware of the remaining 7 through 10. And the 7 through 10 are based on the harmonized tariff system, and that's the import country's own designation of the digits. So think of it as globally the first 6, and then the next 4, 7 through 10, are based on the import country. The U.S. uses the harmonized tariff system of the United States. So you'll see that, HTS US. So that drives that. So just so you can kind of see that visually, this is what that looks like. So this is a valid HTS into the U.S. It's, the chapter heading, chapter 10, subheading 06, the class is 20, and that's basically the WCO and the first 6 digits. Think of that as the global classification of that commodity. And then the import classification is those final 4, basically a -40, -20. So that's what an HTS number looks like. But let's look at an example in the U.S. harmonized tariff schedule of the United States. So this is what a page basically looks like. I know it's a little bit blurry. If you kind of make it bigger or see it, it is the RICE chapter in the HTS. And I kind of pulled this in because of the different types of duties that we want to talk about. So you have your HTS classification on the tariff book on the left. Then you have your brief description of the commodity. Then you have your reporting stats, as well as the duty, the rates of duty. Rates of duty can come in the shape of ad valorem duties. And an ad valorem rate is basically a % of the value of the commodity. So let's say we were bringing in $1,000 and it was, a 10% ad valorem rate. The duty is going to be $100. It's just based on the value of the goods. Now, a specific duty rate is different than an ad valorem. It's not a percent. It may be on the weight of the goods coming in. On this rice, if you look right here at the other husked brown rice, it's 2.1 cents per kilogram. So you can see a specific didn't really have anything to do with the value of the goods. It's the weight of the goods that you're bringing in. So the duty on this one would be 2.1 cents per kilogram of rice that you import in. That's specific. Now, the third one would be compound. There is an example on this page, but a compound rate is basically an ad valorem with a specific. So it would be, like 10% duty plus 1.4 cents per kilogram. That's a compound. Think of it as kind of a double, right? They're hitting you with an ad valorem and they're hitting you with a specific. That's a compound duty rate. Not highly likely in the HTS, but there are some in that harmonized tariff. The majority of duty rates coming into the U.S. are ad valorem, so it's a percent of the value. So then you look at this page a little bit closer, that's the general rate. So those are general duty rates of countries. Countries like, our trading partners like Germany, Great Britain, they get this general. You see this column called special, and you can see the word free and all these special, looks like special letters, but we're going to cover them here soon. They're free trade agreements. So these are agreements that the U.S. has come into play with other countries to give them reduced duty rates of merchandise. So you can see for the right in our rice example, right? If we were claiming a free trade agreement, the rate would be free. We wouldn't be paying any duties in terms of that. And column 2 is basically these are countries that the U.S. doesn't particularly want to trade with, and we charge higher duty rates. Currently, there's 4. It's Cuba, North Korea, Russia, and Belarus with the Russia invasion of Ukraine that they got moved to column 2 duty rates. So you can see on that page, maybe you can or you can't, but if you see the rice midway down, it's 11.2% ad valorem. Look at the column 2, it's 30%, almost triple for column 2 countries. So that's something that the U.S. doesn't want to encourage trade with is those 4 column 2 countries currently. And countries can be removed and added to those columns, move to column 2, move to column 1. If we sign a free trade agreement, that country or that free trade agreement would be listed here in the middle section. So that's kind of your harmonized tariff book. And we'll give you a link on where you go out to the International Trade Commission website, and you can basically type in your commodity and look up your tariff and your commodity and get the tariff rates for those. So that's kind of your tariff book. Let's see. That we talked about duties. Now let's talk about fees, because you always hear that, right? Everybody will say, well, what's my duties and fees? And the fees in terms of CBP, and I'm not going to talk excise tax, but think of an excise tax. It's not a fee, it's a tax. So excise tax are on goods like alcohol, tobacco, things like that have excise taxes on them. They're not fees, they're excise taxes. Fees are user fees. And these are kind of what CBP charges, right, to help process merchandise in the goods, kind of handling the transactions, right? And on formal entries, they require a merchandise processing fee. Now, your MPF is only going to be calculated on the value of your merchandise. So when we calculated the duty, or say there's freight and there's insurance on your goods, you don't pay the MPF, a merchandise processing fee, on any of that. It's just the value of the goods. And MPF is calculated at 0.3464% of the value. So the entry minimum, right? Let's say you take your value of your goods, you multiply it by 0.3464, and you're below $29.66. That's the fiscal year 2023 MPF rate. So, these rates every year in October, CBP in the past 5 years has raised them. They keep the calculation the same, 0.3464, but the minimums and max both get raised up. So I would like to say until October 2023, the entry minimum on formal is 29.66, and the maximum is 575.35. So you're going to pay that regardless if you're bringing in high value stuff, and you calculated it that times 0.3464, and it was over the 570.35, 575.35 is your max. That's the most you'd pay in merchandise processing fee. There's another fee if you bring your goods in via ocean, and that is the harbor maintenance fee. Basically, that fee helps CBP and Congress maintain our ports and harbors, whether there's an upgrade project or whether there's things they need to take care of the harbor, seawalls, things like that. But it's only assessed on goods coming in by that mode of transportation, ocean. So if you're moving your goods via air on an air carrier, you're not going to have a harbor maintenance fee. Okay, you're going to have, if you bring it in on the ocean, you are going to have a harbor maintenance fee. And the way to calculate that is 0.125% of the value, okay, on the value of your shipment in terms of that. So there is no min, there is no max to harbor maintenance fee. It is only assessed on ocean goods. So that's important to know. But your MPF is what you basically would be considered that you'd be looking at if you're doing truck, rail, as well as ocean, as well as air into the United States. Okay. We talked about duties, we talked about fees and stuff, and you're probably sitting out there, Russ, what can I do to reduce that expense and that cost? And that is do business with suppliers that have a free trade agreement with the United States. We talked about free trade agreements. You know, it's just an agreement negotiated with 2 or more countries to do reduced duty rates, as well as other things. But typically, for our purview, it's a reduction in duty, right? That's what we want. So the United States, we currently have got 14 TSAs, FTAs in force with 20 countries. So here's basically a list of those in the yellow block. You can see them. We have a free trade agreement with Australia, Bahrain, Chile, Colombia, DOMREP, CAFTA. That's the Caribbean Free Trade Agreement. And that's an agreement where several Caribbean countries were included in that agreement. And those countries were Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. So those are all covered under that one CAFTA Free Trade Agreement. You see Israel, Jordan, Korea, as well as others on there. USMCA, some years ago, right? That was what NAFTA was called. They renamed that, and that is the USMCA trade. It's a negotiation between US, Canada, and Mexico. So, you know, if you're looking at suppliers, you may look at a supplier differently that has an existing free trade agreement than a supplier that doesn't have a free trade agreement. So in free trade agreements, free trade agreements get added. You know, a lot of times people will ask us, you know, what do you think is going to be the next free trade agreement with the United States? And the United States Trade Representative, or the USTR's office, they're responsible for that. They're out there and they're negotiating with countries. And right now the U.S. is negotiating with Taiwan. There's a lot of pressure for the U.S. to get a trade agreement with Great Britain, because Great Britain being such a good ally to the United States. There's a big push on the USTR to get a U.S. Great Britain free trade agreement, or a trade agreement out there with Great Britain. If I had my money, if I had to bet on a country, maybe it's Taiwan at this point. I think they're probably going to be the next country that gets a free trade agreement, or really, you don't really can say free, because sometimes it's a reduction in duty and it may not be all the way down to free. And the other key part is when you look up these free trade agreements, you know, say you have one, some of them even it's a free duty and it's a MPF exempt. So you don't have to pay that merchandise processing fee if you can claim that free trade agreement and it's applicable. So some free trade agreements, I like to think of it that they had real good negotiators and they got a reduction in duty as well as the MPF, versus some of them, they didn't think to go ask about no MPF on their entry. So in terms of your free trade agreement research, when you look at those, they'll let you know whether the merchandise processing fee is exempted for that free trade agreement. So be aware of those free trade agreements out there. Like I said, don't worry about it. We're going to have a link at the end that'll give you the link to the USTR's webpage. Out there you go, that have all the existing free trade agreements and all the background on the free trade agreements. Okay. Now, I know sometimes people think that all you're going to deal with is customs on importation, and that's not true. Okay, there are other partner government agencies. To date, to count, there's over 47 government agents, partner government agents that work with CBP on the importation of goods. Obviously, I don't want to go through 47, but I'm going to go through some of the main big ones that we see in the import business, and that being the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. So if you're thinking about importing cosmetics, food items, things like that, not only are you going to have to clear customs, you're going to have to clear the Food and Drug Administration. And typically, suppliers or shippers that are shipping those commodities, they understand the requirements of the Food and Drug Administration, and they're probably registered and they have product codes and things like that. They'll share that information with you. That's what gets transmitted to the FDA. They get purview of the data, the entry data that we send to CBP as well in terms of your broker. Fish and wildlife, you know, if you're going to import something exotic like, you know, I don't know, alligator belts or crocodile purses, those are going to fall under the purview of Fish and Wildlife. You know, their mission is to conserve, protect, and enhance fish and wildlife and plants. So that's another agency that you may do business with. If you're into exotics, you don't see a whole lot of fish and wildlife import goods into the United States. The other one, U.S. Department of Ag, the USDA, they regulate dairy products, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds. So if you were thinking about, you know, importing some nuts, things like that, one, you're going to have to clear customs, and you're probably going to have to clear the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, as well. DOT, let's say you were going to bring in some aftermarket car parts, you know, some safety belts, some things like that that are monitored and regulated by the Department of Transportation. So DAT could be another partner government agency that you may have to clear through that agency, as well as CBP. Lastly, you know, ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, it's kind of self-explanatory for that bureau there. You know, if you're going to import alcohol or you're going to import tobacco products, you're probably going to have to clear through the ATF as well as CBP in terms of that. So good to know. Like I said, there's 47 other agencies. I won't bore you with that. You can look them all up if you want. Let's move to duty payments. You've cleared the goods, you've done the duty. We know the duty's due in 10 days. What are ways to pay the duties and taxes? And there's kind of two ways. In the slide deck, it says UPS, but you know, you can arrange for someone else to pay the duties and bill you after. But typically what you see, if somebody's going to pay your duties and taxes, they're going to charge you a disbursement fee. And that's going to be a percentage of the amount they have to outlay, right? So UPS does pay duties and taxes and bill our clients later, but we do charge a disbursement fee for that. There is a fee of, think of that, money float for that till you pay your UPS bill, but UPS will pay customs the duties and taxes. Now you can say, well, Russ, you know, we import a lot. I don't really want to be paying a bunch of disbursement fees. You've done an analysis and, you know, you're paying a lot of money in disbursement fees. How can I get rid of those disbursement fees? You can basically be set up on ACH, and that's automated clearinghouse. And there's no disbursement fees associated with ACH, because how ACH works, it's kind of, think of it as, it's like a direct withdrawal from CBP. When you're set up on ACH and you have your import, you have your entry come in, it's 10 days later, they're going to come to that account and they're going to pull out the duties and taxes from your account. You know, it's like a lot of utility companies that are set up on your checking accounts today, kind of an electronic transfer or an electronic debit for the duties and taxes. So you can be set up on ACH and you wouldn't have to pay a broker or a duty provider a disbursement fee. In the video, it talked about liquidation, and entries are liquidated by CBP. And it's basically meaning that they've been looked at, they're accepted, they've agreed with the information. Usually occurs 1 year. Typically it's 314 days later. They I like to think of it as, you know, close the file, store it, and put it away. You know, CBP is not going to come back on you unless they do a 5-year audit or an audit on your entry and importations. And that leads into record keeping, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier, is customs paperwork. You have to keep it if you're the IOR. Brokers keep them for 5 years as well as part of their statutory requirement. So they keep it for 5 years. So customs can come in, they can request up to 5 years of your imports and look over those entries and check them for accuracy as well. Typically, if they've been liquidated, you don't have a big concern. The main thing customs would be looking at there would be valuation concerns. Have you been undervaluing goods? Things like that is what they're going to be looking at. Falsifying free trade agreement claims. You know, you claimed a free trade agreement, but you weren't eligible. Those are the kind of things they're going to look at in an audit if customs comes knocking on your door and wants to look at your importation documents. So record keeping be the last thing, like I said, to keep your records. Then, as promised, I know we said we'd give you a lot of great links. You know, I love that video at the beginning that Natasha shared. That video is out there under basic importing and exporting, cbp.gov. You know, and really you can just type cbp.gov in your web browser, and that's going to pull up CBP's website. In terms of that, lots of information out there, probably more information than you would ever need, but cbp.gov has a lot of great import information in terms of that. The latest HTS lookup, you know, we looked at that page of the tariff. There's the harmonized tariff schedule search, and that's on the International Trade Commission.gov, the USITC, right out there on their website, and that's a link. Please download this under related content. Download this PowerPoint, keep it just for the links. You know, if you think the information is valuable, that's great, but really just keep it for the links that we've provided here. The USTR under those free trade agreements, you know, like I said, you know, who knows, maybe Taiwan will have a free trade agreement here, maybe in the end of this year, maybe into 2024, maybe Taiwan gets a free trade agreement. You can keep up with that at the ustr.gov is where that would be. And then obviously there's a ton of information out there as well under ups.com, under importing, under international shipping. There's a wealth of information that you can glean off of ups.com. So I urge you to go out there. So I will take a second because I know the QA box has just been ringing off the hook, Natasha, and I have some Q&A assistants helping me. This time we'll spend a few minutes, 5-10 minutes, talking about the QA. Hopefully Q&A questions that we can answer for you, or any questions that you might have based on the webinar. All right, Natasha, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Russ. Just a quick reminder, you can download a copy of the presentation slides that Russ did just review under the related content panel at the bottom of your screen. And the webinar and all of our previous webinars will be posted at www.ups.com/webinars. So as Russ stated, we do have some questions lined up in the chat, so we'll get to as many as we can. And for the questions that we have not answered, we will address afterwards and provide a response. So here we go. Russ, the tariffs that are imposed on imports from China, do you pay the tariffs and then apply for exemption to get a refund, or is it automatically granted?
Natasha, can you read the first part of that one? You kind of came in and out.
Okay, sorry. The tariffs that are imposed on imports from China, do you pay the tariffs and then apply for exemption to get the refund, or is the exemption automatically granted?
Okay, I think what they're talking about there is the China 301 duties, the additional 25% on commodities. Yeah, those are required at the time of release. So you have to pay the China 301 duties. They'd be calculated in addition to your regular duties and taxes that you would be assessed. So yeah, you'd have to pay those. And then if you have an exception, you would go back and file post-summary PSC to get that from that. If you didn't have the exception at the time of payment. I guess that question might be related to if he's asking, if he has the exemption, does he have to pay the 25%? And no, if he has the exemption, right, he would not have to pay the 25% up front as long as he has the exemption. It depends on when he received the exemption.
And where can they get a list of those tariffs for exemptions for China 301?
Yep, Section 301 out there on the ustr.gov's website. They have a great section on Chapter 301s, and you can actually see all the exemptions granted. Because of the interesting thing about the China 301 exemptions, it doesn't matter who asked for it, it's the product. So let's say the USTR gave an exemption on ink pens from China. Whether who imports it, it's an exemption on ink pens from China. So anybody could claim that exemption. It doesn't mean that you asked the USTR for that exemption. The exemption is based on the commodity, not who asked for it. So that's important to note. And all that information is out there on ustr.gov under their Section 301 section under that website. So look that up.
Okay. What is the limit for single entry bonds per year?
The limit for single entry bonds?
Yes.
I'm not aware of any limit on single entry bonds. You could purchase single entry bonds as needed, right? Because think about it, they're only good for one import at a time. So, you may purchase a single entry bond from UPS, and you could go purchase a single entry bond from someone else. Say they offered you a better rate. You could, I'll call it single entry bond shopping, right? You could go around and see who has the best competitive rates on single entry bonds. Okay.
Are multiple packages sent at the same time considered a single entry?
There is such thing as consolidated clearance, and you can take packages shipped all together to different consignees, right? And they can be cleared as one entry under a consolidated entry. In terms of that, there are rules for consolidated entry. They have to arrive all at the same time. They have to move on the same carriage, whether that be aircraft. Typically, you see that in the air environment. All those packages show up together. They may be going to all different destinations, but they can be cleared under one entry. Yes.
Okay. Surety bonds. Do you need to purchase one from each carrier, or can you just have one?
Oh, no, that's a great question. The bond is yours, so you don't need to purchase a bond for each carrier. Think of it as your bond is good to any carrier in terms of that. Basically, when you purchase it, it's your bond. You can use it, with UPS. You can use it with other competitors or anything like that. It's your bond, and you can put that continuous bond out there and share that with your multiple brokers.
Okay, thanks, Russ. With regards to an IOR, is it possible to use IOR services from a third party hired by the company that bought something, say, overseas?
Yes, yeah, you see this a lot going into Europe as well as other countries. There is the ability to have an IOR services. Now, there are fees associated with that, and basically they will help and act as a liaison between the two parties, the shipper and the consignee, right? So certainly it depends on the country, and they do allow IOR services from third parties. So yeah, third party IOR services, they are available.
DAP, is that duty unpaid?
DAP is delivered at place. So basically the seller is responsible for the delivery of the goods, ready for unloading at the named place of destination, often the buyer's place of business. So the seller will generally assume all risk and pays all charges associated with the shipment up to the named place of destination.
And then can you explain the difference between HTS and Schedule B? Is there a difference, or are they the same?
They are different. Your Schedule B is basically the number that you'll hear used for export. And your Schedule B numbers aren't the 10 digits numbers in terms of that. So Schedule B and HTS US, they can be different. First six will not be, right, because it's the WCO dictates the first 6 digits.
Okay. Is there a place to find out what each country's customs allow as far as a shipment to go through?
That's a great question. I know that out on UPS.com, you can put in shipment legs, like say US to GB or US to another country, and it will talk you through different scenarios. So yes, I would start with UPS.com on that.
And our last question that we will have time for today, do you need to provide free trade agreement certificates from the exporter for import entries?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that depends on the free trade agreement, right? When NAFTA was in play, you did have to provide a NAFTA certificate to, have NAFTA apply to your goods. Under USMCA, when they reintroduced and they rewrote that to the USMCA, basically they did away with the form. You can still have a USMCA form, but you can also claim that by a declaration statement on the commercial invoice. So you don't need a form, you just need that declaration statement to be on the commercial invoice. So unfortunately, all the free trade agreements are different. Some of them require the statement, the certificate of origin, the statement, and then some require an actual form. So, but you can get all those requirements off of the USTRs.gov under the free trade agreement requirements. Great question.
Wow, thanks, Russ, for providing us with Imports 101, Get to Know the Basics presentation. A lot of great material and a lot of great questions you were able to answer during this time. So I'd like to thank everyone for spending your time with UPS on this webinar on the Imports 101. We hope this helps provide a greater insight on various aspects of importing. Just a reminder, you can download the presentation and have access to the links that were in the presentation that Russ gave, as well as the video. And thanks again, and hope you have a nice day.
All right. Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.